prior diagnostic criteria for rosacea were based on 2002 expert consensus recommendations from the National Rosacea Society. Subsequently, these have been very extensively used in research, both in epidemiologic studies, population-based studies, as well as in clinical trials. And the diagnosis of rosacea was based on the presence of any one of the following features. Number one, flushing or temporary erythema. The second was fixed erythema. The third was papules and pustules. And then the last were on features that were related to telangiectasia. The issues therein, when we looked at this very critically in a consensus group effort called the Rosacea Global Consensus Group, was to understand what the predictive values of each of these features were in determining whether rosacea was positive and present or not. And what we realized was that there was a low predictive value for a number of those otherwise initially called primary features. The issue was, for example, with flushing, then with papules, pustules, then with telangiectasia. And let me outline those to you. For example, with flushing, there are a lot of other common conditions that lead to flushing that are not rosacea-based. In fact, one of the most common is emotional flushing, also perimenopausal flushing, and that is not rosacea related. So when these are two common factors that can lead to flushing itself as an individual feature of rosacea, it reduces the positive predictive value of that sign being of use as a diagnostic criterion. The second was papules and pustules. And what we found with that was that there's a very common condition that is characterized by papules and pustules, acne. Acne is characterized by papules, pustules, and comedones. And because of that, as well as folliculitis and dermocosmetic, we felt that that was also of low positive predictive value in the diagnosis of rosacea as an individual feature. The third was telangiectasias. Telangiectasias in adults, if you look at perinasal areas and infranasal areas, almost every adult will have telangiectasias. So how could that by itself be a positive predictive factor in the diagnosis of rosacea? So we asked and started from those very basic questions and reassorted why the diagnosis of rosacea should not be the following. Number one, fixed central facial erythema. And herein we don't talk about the scaly erythema that's characteristic of seborrheic dermatitis, because dermatologists recognize that as a separate entity. We also are excluding the butterfly erythema of lupus, because again, dermatologists recognize that as a separate entity because of the associated other features of lupus erythematosus, including the facial notion of cheilitis, which is very characteristic of lupus erythematosus and facial involvement, but not of rosacea. And the other part, which was telangiectasias, I think we've briefly touched on as well. Then the question was, what about phyma? Phyma is so highly characteristic of rosacea. Why isn't it part of the individual diagnostic criterion? Really, there are very few other conditions that lead to phyma, or nasal thickening. One of them is rhinoscleroma, from a condition that is infectious from Klebsiella scleromatous. The other one is sarcoidosis or granulomatous inflammation. And then the third are B and T cell lymphomas. Very unusual, rather rare conditions. And within the context of rosacea, then the presence of phyma, once those are excluded, should be a very high positive predictive value feature. So what we did was to reassort the diagnostic criterion into those that are individually indicative of rosacea, that is fixed central facial erythema or phyma. And that was it. The criterion that were secondary, but none of them individually were diagnostic, but if you had two or more, they could be. would be papules and pustules, flushing, telangiectasias, and ocular features.